At my daughter's wedding, I caught her telling her wealthy mother-in-law, "She's just a miserable loser, not at all like you." So I rose during the toasts and played a recording her late father had made before he passed. The room went absolutely silent. Can you imagine standing at your own daughter's wedding, a day that should be filled with nothing but pure joy and pride, only to overhear her whisper the most gut-wrenching betrayal? She called me a pathetic failure, right to her rich mother-in-law. My blood ran absolutely cold, but what she didn't know was I had a secret weapon in my purse, a letter from her deceased father, meant for just such a moment. And when the time was right, I was going to use it. My name is Dorothy Williams, but everyone just calls me Dot. I'm 68 years old, and until about 2 weeks ago, I truly believed my daughter, Sarah, respected me. Oh, how wrong I was about so many things. This wedding, it was everything Sarah had ever dreamed of since she was a little girl. Held at the stunning Ashford family estate in Connecticut, a place with manicured gardens and a mansion straight out of a movie. 200 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, enough flowers to fill a botanical garden. Michael Ashford's family had money, the kind that stretches back generations, and Sarah had landed exactly what she always wanted. I'd driven up that morning from my small apartment in Hartford, wearing the navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. It wasn't designer, but I thought it was perfectly respectable. Until I saw the other guests. The women wore clothes that cost more than my monthly rent, diamonds that sparkled like constellations, and carried that particular, almost arrogant, confidence that only comes from never, ever having to check your bank balance. Sarah, though, she looked absolutely breathtaking. She was wearing her grandmother's vintage Chanel dress, the one I'd carefully preserved for 40 years. It was the same dress I'd worn when I married her father, Frank, back when we were young and naive enough to think love alone was enough to build a life on. She'd insisted on wearing it, and I was so foolish, so desperate to believe it meant something sentimental to her. How utterly, tragically naive I was. The ceremony itself was perfect, if you're into that sort of grand, opulent affair. I sat in the second row, right behind Sarah's college roommate and her husband. Patricia Ashford, Michael's mother, was in the front, dripping in pearls that probably outvalued my entire car. She'd been politely cold to me since we first met 8 months ago. It was the kind of coldness wrapped in exquisite manners, but it cut just as deep as any insult. After the ceremony, during the cocktail hour, I found myself standing near the terrace doors. The music was playing, guests were chattering, and I probably should have been mingling. But then I heard Sarah's voice. She was talking to Patricia, near a magnificent flower arrangement, likely thinking the background noise would cover their conversation. But I've always had excellent hearing, a blessing and a curse, as any mother will tell you. And then I heard it. The words that changed everything. "Don't worry about her," Sarah was saying, her voice dismissive, with a quick, almost contemptuous glance in my direction. "She's just a pathetic failure. Nothing like you." My breath hitched. Pathetic failure? She's never accomplished anything worthwhile. I mean, she worked at the public library for 30 years. Can you imagine anything more depressing? A wave of pure shock, then a searing heat, flushed through me. Patricia, the ever-so-composed Patricia, just nodded approvingly. Well, at least she knows her place. Some people from simpler backgrounds can be so pushy about inserting themselves where they don't belong. My hand tightened around my champagne glass, the delicate stem threatening to snap. Simpler backgrounds, as if dignity and hard work were something to be ashamed of. My mind raced, flashing back to the double shifts I'd worked, the late nights, the sacrifices Frank and I had made just to put Sarah through college. All the music lessons, the summer camps, all the opportunities we'd never had, poured into her future. And that's when it hit me. Like a punch to the gut, I remembered the letter. The one tucked deep inside my purse. Frank had given it to me a week before he died, with strict, almost prophetic instructions. "If Sarah ever treats you badly," he'd said, his voice weak but his eyes burning with a determined fire, "you read this out loud. Promise me, Dot. She needs to hear what I really thought about some things." I'd carried it with me ever since, a heavy secret, never truly believing I'd actually need to use it. But standing there, listening to my own daughter describe me as a pathetic failure to a woman who saw me as beneath her very notice, I realized Frank had seen something coming that I, in my blind mother's love, hadn't. He'd been watching Sarah change during his final months, and he hadn't liked what he was seeing one bit. The reception dinner was a blur after that. A dizzying array of forced smiles and meaningless small talk. I was seated at table 8, strategically placed far enough from the head table to be out of sight, yet close enough to avoid being obviously exiled. My dinner companions were distant relatives of Michael's family, who made polite conversation about the weather and the beautiful flowers, all while carefully, delicately avoiding any questions about what I did for a living. I just picked at my salmon, watching Sarah. She worked the room like the politician she'd always wanted to be. She'd graduated from Yale with a degree in public relations and now ran social media campaigns for wealthy clients. I had to admit, she was good at it. She knew exactly how to present herself, how to make people feel important, how to say all the right things. Tonight, she was the perfect bride, gracious, radiant, everything a rich family would want in a daughter-in-law. But I knew the real Sarah. The one who'd called me crying when her college rent was due. The one who'd moved back home for 8 months after a disastrous relationship in her 20s. The one who'd sat by Frank's bedside during his final weeks, holding his hand, promising to take care of me after he was gone. Or so I'd thought. Then came the father-daughter dance. They played The Way You Look Tonight, Frank's favorite song. Sarah danced with Michael instead, of course, since Frank wasn't there to twirl her around the dance floor one last time. I watched her smile and laugh, apparently unbothered by his absence. When the song ended, she didn't even glance toward the empty chair where I'd carefully placed his photo. It was then, in that moment of profound emptiness, that I knew. I had to read Frank's letter. Not to hurt Sarah, not really. But to understand what had happened to the daughter I thought I knew. To understand the chasm that had opened between us. I slipped away during the dancing, finding a quiet, dimly lit corner in the mansion's vast library. The Ashfords probably had more books than our entire town library, though I suspected most of them were just for show. My fingers trembled as I pulled out the worn envelope Frank had given me. His handwriting, shaky but still so recognizable, was across the front, for Dorothy, only if you need it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Frank's careful, deliberate script. The date at the top showed he'd written it just 3 days before he died. My dearest Dot, it began. If you're reading this, it means Sarah has shown you who she's become, not who she used to be. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know this will hurt, but you need to know what I observed during my final weeks. My heart was already racing, a frantic drumbeat in my chest, but I forced myself to keep reading. Sarah has been different since she started seeing Michael. Not just happy different, but calculated different. She's been asking questions about our finances, about my will, about what would happen to you after I'm gone. When I asked why, she said she was worried about your future, but I've been watching her, Dot. And I don't think worry is the right word. A chill, a deep, unsettling chill, went right through me. And it had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the elegant library. Yesterday, the letter continued. She brought me papers from something called Meadowbrook Manor, an assisted living facility. She said she'd been researching options for your future, places where you could be properly cared for after I died. She had brochures, pricing information, even a waiting list application. When I asked her why she thought you'd need assisted living at 68, she just said it was planning ahead. The letter continued for another painful page, each observation more devastating than the last. Frank describing Sarah's increasing impatience with his medical needs. Her casual comments about how expensive his medications were becoming. Her gentle suggestions that perhaps I was getting too old to live alone safely. I changed my will, Dot, he wrote, and I gasped aloud. Everything goes to you now, with instructions that she can't contest. But more than that, I want you to know that the daughter we raised is still in there somewhere. She's just lost her way. Don't let her convince you that you're a burden. You're the best thing I ever did with my life. And if she can't see that, it's her loss, not yours. The letter was signed simply, "Forever yours, Frank," with a postscript that made my hand tremble so violently I almost dropped the page. P.S. I saw the Meadowbrook Manor brochure in her purse again today. She's planning something. Don't let her do it. When I finished reading, I sat there in that elegant library, surrounded by books that probably cost more than most people's cars, and I finally understood. I understood why Frank, in his dying days, had made me promise to use this letter if I needed to. He'd spent his final, precious moments not just fighting cancer, but protecting me from a daughter who, to his horror, saw his death as an opportunity rather than an immeasurable loss. I rejoined the reception with Frank's words echoing in my mind, a relentless drumbeat against the joyful music. His letter hadn't contained shocking revelations or complex investigations, just the careful, loving observations of a dying man who'd noticed his daughter's growing coldness and selfishness. But those simple observations painted a picture that utterly broke my heart. Sarah hadn't suddenly turned cruel. She'd been planning my future without consulting me, researching ways to have me declared incompetent or unsafe to live alone. Frank had seen it happening, and he'd tried to warn me the only way he could. I watched Sarah accept congratulations from the guests, her smile bright and practiced. But now I could see what Frank had noticed. The way she calculated each interaction. The subtle, almost imperceptible impatience when someone took too long to make their point. The careful way she steered conversations away from anything that might reflect poorly on her new, elevated status. Mrs. Williams, a young man, appeared at my elbow, one of Michael's cousins whose name I'd completely forgotten. Michael wanted me to make sure you were enjoying yourself. Can I get you anything? I managed a polite smile. I'm fine, thank you. It's a beautiful wedding. The Ashford family certainly knows how to throw a party, he agreed, then lowered his voice conspiratorially. Though between you and me, it's nice to see Michael settling down with someone so practical. After some of the socialites he used to date, Sarah seems refreshingly down-to-earth. Practical. Down-to-earth. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. If only he knew what my down-to-earth daughter was planning for my immediate future. I thanked him and moved away, needing space to think, to breathe. The irony was overwhelming. Here was Sarah, so desperate to become part of high society, surrounded by people who genuinely appreciated her for the very qualities she was so actively trying to shed: her work ethic, her intelligence, her ability to genuinely connect with people. All things she'd learned growing up in a modest household, with parents who valued character over status. But Frank's letter had revealed something else, something far more chilling. Sarah wasn't just trying to fit in with the Ashfords. She was actively trying to distance herself from everything that reminded her of her origins, including me. I found myself studying the other guests with new, stark eyes. The women Patricia's age moved through the crowd with the unwavering confidence of people who'd never once doubted their place in the world. They had the kind of security that comes from generational wealth, from never having to worry about mortgage payments or whether you could afford to retire. That's what Sarah wanted. Not just money, but the profound peace of mind that comes with never having to think about money. And in her meticulously calculated mind, taking care of an aging mother was a liability, a threat to that precious security. The reception was winding down, but I knew the real evening was just beginning. Frank had given me more than just his observations about Sarah's plans. He'd given me permission. Permission to fight back if I needed to. And as I watched my daughter play her role as the perfect bride, I began to understand that I was going to need that permission more than I ever could have imagined. During the bouquet toss, Sarah looked directly at me and smiled. It was the first genuine attention she'd paid me all evening, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe Frank had been wrong. Maybe his illness had made him suspicious of perfectly innocent behavior. Then I heard her conversation with Patricia again, just moments later, as they stood near me. "Thank goodness that tradition is over," Sarah said, adjusting her veil. "I was worried some desperate woman would knock you over trying to catch it." Patricia laughed, a brittle, social sound. "Well, at least your mother didn't try. At her age, remarriage would be rather pathetic, don't you think?" "Oh, Mom's past all that," Sarah replied casually, as if talking about a pet. "She's focusing on more age-appropriate activities now. Quiet hobbies, simple routines. It's probably better for her to accept the limitations that come with getting Older. Limitations. At 68, I was supposed to accept limitations and fade quietly into the background while my daughter built her glittering new life. Frank's letter, heavy in my purse, suddenly felt like a lifeline rather than a burden. He'd seen this coming, and he'd tried to protect me the only way he could. I had a choice to make. I could continue being the gracious, unobtrusive mother who didn't embarrass her successful daughter. Or I could remember that I was Dorothy Williams, a woman who'd raised a child, built a career, and supported a husband through cancer treatment. A woman who deserved better than being written off as a pathetic failure by her own flesh and blood. The next morning, I drove back to Hartford, my mind clearer than it had been in months. Frank's letter had given me a different, chilling perspective on my recent conversations with Sarah. It wasn't enough to feel hurt or angry. I realized I needed to do some research of my own. My first stop was the public library, the place I'd worked for 30 years. Margaret, my dear friend and colleague, hugged me warmly when I walked in that Monday morning. How was the wedding? I want to hear everything about this fancy family Sarah married into. I'd always liked Margaret's directness. She was 5 years younger than me, but had started working at the library the same week I did, fresh out of library school and full of boundless energy. We'd been friends through raises and budget cuts, difficult patrons and technology upgrades that left us both feeling ancient. It was quite an experience, I said carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral. Actually, I was hoping you could help me with something. I'm curious about assisted living facilities in Connecticut, particularly one called Meadowbrook Manor. Margaret raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but she didn't ask questions. That was another thing I'd always appreciated about her. She understood that information was power and, sometimes, you needed to gather it before you knew exactly how you'd use it. An hour later, we'd compiled quite a file from public records and online reviews. Meadowbrook Manor was indeed exclusive and expensive, just as Sarah's brochures had implied. But it had something else that caught my attention, a program for asset protection that allowed residents to sign over their entire estates in exchange for guaranteed lifetime care. More interesting and far more alarming was what we found in the online reviews. Several families had complained about high-pressure sales tactics, about feeling rushed into decisions during incredibly emotional periods, usually right after a spouse's death. The state had investigated the facility twice in the past 5 years for inappropriate marketing to vulnerable seniors. Well, Margaret said, printing out the last of our research, her brow furrowed. This place certainly seems aggressive about acquiring new residents, and their asset protection program looks designed to separate seniors from their money. I thanked Margaret and drove home with a box full of documents that painted a very different, very sinister picture of Meadowbrook Manor than Sarah's carefully curated brochures had suggested. But more than that, I had a plan forming in my mind. Frank's letter was just the beginning. What I needed now was to understand exactly what Sarah was planning and why. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Sarah's college roommate, Jennifer, who'd been at the wedding and had always been more forthcoming than Sarah about family gossip. Under the guise of wanting to send a proper thank you note to the Ashfords, I asked some casual questions about the family's background. What I learned was enlightening. The Ashfords were indeed wealthy, but their money was relatively new. Michael's grandfather had made his fortune in manufacturing after World War II. Patricia had married into the family 30 years ago, and according to Jennifer's gossipy sources, she'd spent those decades carefully crafting their social position. Sarah's so lucky, Jennifer confided, her voice bubbling with envy. Patricia's been taking her to all the right charity events, introducing her to the right people. She's already talking about getting Sarah onto some museum boards. After hanging up, I sat in my small apartment, the late afternoon sun streaming through my window, and thought about what I'd learned. Sarah wasn't just marrying into money. She was marrying into a social climbing project that had been going on for decades. And Patricia saw Sarah as a useful tool in that project. Someone young, educated, and presentable enough to help maintain their carefully constructed position in Connecticut society. But that still didn't quite explain Sarah's plans for me. Not until I remembered something Frank had mentioned in his letter, Sarah's increasing impatience with the cost of things. My medications, my apartment rent, the small expenses that inevitably come with having an aging parent. I pulled out my checkbook and looked at the records from the past year. Sarah had been right about one thing. My expenses had increased. New medications for my arthritis, higher insurance premiums, the cost of having my apartment painted when the management company raised the rent. Nothing dramatic, but the kind of steady, incremental increase that comes with aging. Then, with a sickening lurch, I realized what Sarah was really afraid of. It wasn't that I needed assisted living now. It was that I might need expensive care in the future. And if I spent down my savings on long-term care, there would be nothing left for her to inherit. Frank's letter had been about protecting me from Sarah's immediate plans. But my own research had revealed something even more disturbing. My daughter saw me not as a person with needs and feelings, but as a financial liability that needed to be managed efficiently. That night, I made a decision that would have shocked the old Dorothy. I wasn't going to wait for Sarah to make the next move. I was going to find out exactly what she was planning, and then, with Frank's words as my shield, I was going to decide what to do about it. 2 weeks after the wedding, Sarah called to invite me to lunch. She sounded unusually warm and friendly, which immediately put me on high alert. Sarah was never warm and friendly unless she wanted something. And after Frank's letter, I had a pretty good idea what that something might be. We met at a trendy bistro in West Hartford, the kind of place that served small portions on large plates and charged accordingly. Sarah looked radiant, still glowing from her honeymoon in Italy. She'd always photographed well, but marriage to Michael had given her a new confidence that was almost blinding. "Mom, you look tired," she said, kissing my cheek before we sat down, her eyes assessing, not truly caring. "Are you sleeping okay? Eating enough? I've been worried about you living alone in that little apartment." I ordered a salad and listened to her talk about the honeymoon, about Michael's family's vacation home in the Hamptons, about the charity boards Patricia was helping her join. It was like listening to someone describe a life from a magazine. All perfectly arranged details designed to impress. Finally, after we'd ordered coffee and dessert, Sarah got to the point. "Mom, Michael and I have been talking, and we're concerned about your future. That apartment you're renting is so small, and the neighborhood isn't getting any safer. We think it's time you considered moving somewhere more appropriate for someone your age." "Appropriate?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, my heart pounding a steady rhythm of apprehension. "Well, somewhere secure, with medical services nearby, maybe some social activities." Sarah smiled brightly, a politician's smile. "Patricia knows about this wonderful senior community about an hour from our house. Very exclusive, very nice. The waiting list is usually years long, but they have a spot opening up next month." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "Senior community. Sarah, I'm perfectly capable of living independently." "Of course you are now, Mom, but it's about planning ahead. And honestly, it would give us all peace of mind to know you're somewhere safe." Sarah reached across the table and patted my hand, a gesture that felt utterly performative. "The best part is, you wouldn't have to worry about finances anymore. They have a program where you can transfer your assets, and they guarantee care for life." There it was. The asset protection program I'd researched with Margaret. Sarah wanted me to sign over my inheritance, my savings, everything Frank had left me, in exchange for a room in an institution where she could visit occasionally and feel virtuous about taking care of her mother. "That's very thoughtful," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice even, though a storm was brewing inside me. "But I'm not ready to make that kind of decision yet. I'm enjoying my independence." Sarah's smile tightened, just barely. "Mom, I understand that it's hard to admit when you might need help in the future. But Dad's been gone for 3 years now. You can't keep pretending you can handle everything on your own indefinitely." "I'm not pretending anything, Sarah. I'm managing just fine. Are you?" Sarah's voice took on a sharper edge, a hint of steel. "Because I've noticed you seem a bit scattered lately. Forgetting appointments, missing calls. Patricia mentioned that you seemed confused at the wedding. Out of place." A flash of pure, righteous anger ignited within me. I seemed confused. I said, my voice dangerously quiet, because I was listening to you call me a pathetic failure. That tends to be disorienting. Sarah blinked, clearly not expecting me to confront her so directly. I never said that. Her face was a mask of indignant surprise. You told Patricia I was a pathetic failure who'd never accomplished anything worthwhile. You said working at the library for 30 years was depressing. I kept my voice level, watching her carefully. I heard you, Sarah. That's not. You're taking things out of context. Sarah looked genuinely flustered for the first time. I was just trying to reassure her that you weren't going to be demanding or difficult by calling me a failure. By explaining that you have realistic expectations about your place in our lives going forward. Sarah's carefully constructed mask was slipping, revealing the cold calculation underneath. Mom, this isn't about what you overheard. This is about being practical. You're 68 years old. You need to start planning for the future. I signaled for the check, a finality in my gesture, and started gathering my purse. Sarah, I am planning for the future. I'm planning to live my life on my own terms for as long as I'm able. And when you're not able? Her voice was rising, laced with genuine fear. When you fall and break a hip, or have a stroke, or develop dementia, who do you think is going to take care of you? The question hung in the air between us, heavy and accusatory, and I realized this was the heart of it. Sarah wasn't worried about my current needs. She was terrified of my future needs. She wanted me safely warehoused where my aging wouldn't inconvenience her glittering new life. I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, I said, standing up. But Sarah, when that time comes, I hope I'll still have a daughter who sees me as a person worth caring about. Not just a problem to be solved. As I drove home, a strange mix of sadness and resolve filled me. I thought about Frank's final, heartbreaking gift to me. Not just the letter warning me about Sarah's plans, but the profound knowledge that he'd seen our daughter's transformation happening and had tried, in his dying breath, to protect me from it. Sarah thought she was maneuvering me into a corner. What she didn't realize was that she was actually revealing exactly how far she was willing to go to protect her new status, her carefully cultivated future. And that was a vulnerability I now understood. A month after Sarah's lunch invitation, she called again. This time, I could hear other voices in the background, and the formal, clipped tone in her voice told me she was performing for an audience. Mom, we need to talk. Can you come over this evening? Michael and I have some family business to discuss with you. I agreed, though I suspected I knew exactly what kind of family business they had in mind. I spent the afternoon preparing, rereading Frank's letter, making sure I understood exactly what I was walking into. Sarah and Michael's house in West Hartford was everything she'd always dreamed of, colonial style, perfectly landscaped, in a neighborhood where the median income required 2 professional salaries and significant family money. Sarah had posted dozens of photos of it on social media, showcasing each room like a magazine spread. When I arrived, I found Sarah, Michael, and Patricia waiting in the formal living room. The staging was deliberate, almost theatrical. I was seated alone on one side, while the 3 of them faced me from the sofa, a united front. It felt like an intervention, which I suppose, in their minds, it was. Dorothy, Patricia began, her voice warm but authoritative, like a velvet-covered iron fist. We wanted to talk to you about some concerns we've all been having. Sarah jumped in, picking up the thread. Mom, you've seemed more forgetful lately. Missing appointments, not returning calls promptly. Small things, but they're adding up. Michael nodded gravely, playing his part. We think you might be experiencing some early cognitive changes. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it's something we need to address proactively. I listened to their carefully rehearsed presentation with growing understanding and a rising tide of fury. They'd constructed a narrative about my declining mental health. But unlike the fabricated examples I might have expected, these were subtle distortions of normal behavior. The missed appointment had been rescheduled by me due to a conflict. The unreturned calls were from telemarketers and Sarah's friend Jennifer, not urgent communications. The good news, Patricia continued, a triumphant gleam in her eye, is that we've been able to secure you a place at Meadowbrook Manor. They have an opening next week, and we can arrange the transition quickly. All you need to do is sign these papers, Michael said, pulling out a thick folder of documents: power of attorney, asset transfer agreements, healthcare directives, everything. Everything to make the transition smooth and protect your interests. I looked at the three of them, these people who thought they could manipulate me, their dear Dorothy, into signing away my life with exaggerated concerns about my mental capacity. Sarah sat there, nodding encouragingly, playing the role of the concerned daughter while planning to inherit everything her father had left me. "This is quite a production," I said finally, my voice calm, almost detached, but with an underlying steel. "How long have you been planning this intervention?" Sarah's practiced smile faltered, just for a second. "Mom, this isn't a production. We're genuinely worried about you." "Are you?" I pulled out Frank's letter, the envelope worn from being carried in my purse for weeks, a tangible link to his protective love. "Because I have something I think you'll all find interesting." I unfolded the single sheet of paper, the quiet rustle of it loud in the room, and began to read aloud. Frank's careful, devastating observations about Sarah's questions concerning my finances, her research into assisted living facilities, her growing impatience with the costs of having an aging mother. She brought me papers from something called Meadowbrook Manor. I read, my voice steady, an assisted living facility. She said she'd been researching options for your future, places where you could be properly cared for after I died. Sarah went completely white, her jaw dropping. Michael frowned in confusion, a flicker of concern crossing his handsome face. Patricia's composed expression didn't change, but I saw her hands clench slightly in her lap, a telltale sign of her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. When I asked her why she thought you'd need assisted living at 68, she said it was just planning ahead, I continued. But I've been watching her, and I don't think planning is the right word. As Frank's letter continued, detailing his observations about Sarah's calculated approach to my future care, I watched my daughter's face cycle through shock, panic, and finally, a cold calculation I'd never seen before, a mirror of Patricia's own steely resolve. When I finished reading, the silence in the room was absolute. It stretched, thick and suffocating, until Michael finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost an accusation. "Sarah, is this true? Were you researching assisted living facilities while your father was dying?" That's when I realized this confrontation was just the beginning of something much, much larger. "That letter proves nothing," Sarah finally managed, but her voice shook, betraying her. "Dad was sick, probably confused. He was seeing problems that weren't there." I folded the letter carefully and put it back in my purse, a symbolic act of putting my trust back in Frank. "Your father was many things, Sarah, but confused wasn't one of them. Especially not about something this important." Michael was now studying the documents on the coffee table, the power of attorney forms, the asset transfer agreements, the Meadowbrook Manor paperwork. His gaze was sharper, more focused. "Sarah, when exactly did you start researching this place?" "I was just being prepared," Sarah said defensively, her voice still trembling. "Someone had to think ahead about Mom's future needs." "While your father was dying of cancer?" Michael's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it I hadn't heard before, an undeniable accusation. "You were planning to move your mother into assisted living while he was fighting for his life." Patricia tried to intervene, ever the social arbiter. "Michael, I think we should focus on Dorothy's current situation rather than relitigating past decisions." "Should we?" I asked, turning to Patricia with genuine, if somewhat cynical, interest. "Because I did some research of my own after Sarah mentioned Meadowbrook Manor. Did you know they've been investigated twice by the state for aggressive marketing to vulnerable seniors?" For the first time since I'd known her, Patricia looked genuinely uncomfortable, a faint blush rising on her aristocratic cheeks. "I'm sure any successful facility faces occasional regulatory reviews." Occasional reviews about pressuring grieving widows to sign over their assets immediately after their husbands' deaths? I pulled out the folder of public records Margaret had helped me compile, the rustle of papers shattering the pristine silence of the room. Because that's what the state found. High-pressure tactics, rushed decision-making, families who felt manipulated into making permanent choices during temporary emotional crises. Sarah made a desperate grab for the papers. "Where did you get these?" "Public records, Sarah," I replied, keeping the documents just out of her reach. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look. The state licensing board, consumer protection agencies, online review sites, all freely available to anyone who bothers to investigate before signing their life away. Michael was reading over my shoulder now, his eyes widening. Jesus, look at these complaints. Felt pressured to decide immediately. High-pressure sales presentation. Regretted signing asset transfer agreement. Sarah, did you actually research this place, or did someone recommend it to you? The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice strained. I may have mentioned that they had an excellent reputation in certain circles. Certain circles being wealthy families looking to warehouse inconvenient relatives? I asked mildly, my gaze steady, challenging her. That's a terrible thing to say. Sarah snapped, her face flushed with shame and anger. We're trying to ensure you get proper care. No, I said, rising to my feet, feeling calmer, more centered than I had in months. You're trying to ensure I don't become a financial burden on your new lifestyle. The difference is that proper care considers what I want, not just what's convenient for you. Michael was still studying the complaint documents, shaking his head. Mom, some of these families sued Meadowbrook. They accused the facility of elder abuse, of manipulating seniors into signing over assets they didn't understand. Patricia's composure was finally, spectacularly, starting to crack. Those are isolated incidents. Every industry has a few bad actors. Are they? I asked, my voice cutting through her flimsy defense. Because according to these records, Meadowbrook has a specific program targeting recent widows. They market to families during funeral planning, offer estate protection services, provide referrals through certain funeral homes and lawyers. I watched the three of them process this information, the accusations hanging heavy in the air. Sarah looked like she was going to be sick. Michael was angry, though I wasn't sure if it was directed at his wife or his mother. Patricia, ever the strategist, was calculating, probably trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Even if the facility has some problems, Sarah said desperately, clutching at straws, that doesn't change the fact that you need to plan for your future. You can't live alone forever, Mom. Why not? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I'm 68, not 88. I'm healthy, mentally sharp, and perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my living situation. But what if something happens? Sarah's voice was rising, a raw, almost desperate edge to it. What if you fall or get sick or need help? You can't expect us to drop everything and take care of you. There it was, the real fear underneath all the feigned concern about my welfare. Sarah wasn't worried about my current needs. She was terrified that my future needs might interfere with her carefully planned new life. I'm not expecting you to take care of me, Sarah, I said, my voice gentle now, laced with a deep sadness. I'm expecting you to respect my right to make my own choices about how I want to live. Those choices affect other people, Patricia said sharply, regaining some of her composure. Family decisions should be made collectively, considering everyone's interests. Everyone's interests, I repeated, looking her squarely in the eye. And what, exactly, are your interests in this situation, Patricia? Patricia straightened in her chair, her social mask firmly back in place. My interest is in seeing this family function harmoniously. Sarah is my daughter-in-law now, and that makes her welfare my concern. And my welfare, does that concern you at all? Of course it does. Which is why we think Meadowbrook would be perfect for you. You'd have security, medical care nearby, social activities with people your own age. I had to admire her persistence. Even caught recommending a facility with a questionable reputation, she was still trying to sell me on the supposed benefits of institutional living. Patricia, I said gently, a small smile playing on my lips. I spent 30 years working at a public library. Do you know what that taught me? How to research things thoroughly, how to spot inconsistencies in people's stories, and how to help people find the information they need to make good decisions. Michael looked up from the complaint documents, his expression thoughtful. What kind of inconsistencies? Well, for instance, when someone recommends a specific facility they claim to have researched, but all their information comes from marketing materials rather than independent sources. I looked directly at Patricia. Or when someone is very eager to see a particular outcome, but can't explain why that outcome is important to them personally. Sarah tried desperately to regain control of the conversation. Mom, you're being paranoid. We're trying to help you. Are you? I sat back down, feeling like I was finally, truly getting somewhere. Because help usually involves asking what the person wants, not telling them what they're going to do. Sarah, in all these conversations about my future, have you ever asked me what I actually want? Of course, we want what's best for you. That's not what I asked. Have you asked me what I want? The silence stretched uncomfortably, palpable, and heavy. Finally, Michael, who seemed genuinely disturbed by what he was witnessing, spoke up. What do you want, Dorothy? I want to live in my own apartment for as long as I'm able. I want to make my own decisions about my healthcare, my finances, and my social life. I want to be treated like a competent adult, not a problem to be managed. I paused, looking at each of them, letting my words sink in. And I want my daughter to see me as a person worth respecting, not just an obligation to be discharged efficiently. Sarah's eyes, for the first time that evening, filled with genuine tears. I do respect you. I'm scared, Mom. I'm scared something will happen to you, and I won't know how to handle it. For the first time all evening, I heard something real, something raw and honest in her voice. Sarah, being scared is normal, I said, softening slightly, but being scared doesn't justify trying to control someone else's life. I'm not trying to control your life. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From making my own mistakes? From living independently? From having the dignity of making my own choices? I reached across the coffee table and took her hand. Sweetheart, I've been taking care of myself for 68 years. I raised you. I supported your father through cancer. I managed a library budget and staff. Why do you suddenly think I'm incapable of managing my own life? Michael was nodding slowly. She has a point, Sarah. Your mother seems pretty sharp to me. Patricia tried one more time, a desperate last gasp. But the financial protections at Meadowbrook are designed to protect the facility's revenue stream, not the residents' interests, I interrupted, cutting her off cleanly. Patricia, I may be old, but I'm not stupid. I can read financial documents, and I can spot a bad deal when I see one. Sarah wiped her eyes with her napkin, looking utterly defeated. So, what happens now? You just go back to your apartment and pretend this never happened. I go back to my apartment and continue living my life. You go back to yours and stop trying to manage mine. I gathered my purse and stood up, the confrontation over. And maybe, if you can learn to see me as an equal rather than a dependent, we can rebuild some kind of relationship. But what if you do need help someday? Sarah asked, her voice small, vulnerable. Then I'll ask for it. And if you're willing to provide it respectfully, without trying to take over my life, maybe we can work something out. I paused at the door, leaving them with one last thought. But Sarah, if I ever need care, it will be my decision how to handle it. Not yours, not Patricia's, not some facility that sees me as a source of revenue. As I drove home, a profound sense of relief washed over me. The evening had gone better than I'd expected. Frank's letter had given me the ammunition I needed, but my own research had given me something far more valuable, the knowledge that I was absolutely right to resist their pressure. More importantly, I'd seen a glimpse of the real Sarah underneath all the calculation. A young woman who was genuinely scared of the responsibilities that came with having aging parents. It didn't excuse her behavior, but it offered a tiny, fragile crack for understanding. 3 weeks later, Sarah called to ask if we could have coffee. Just the two of us, she said. No Michael, no Patricia, no agenda about my living situation. I was skeptical, but curious enough to agree. We met at a small cafe near the library. Neutral territory, where neither of us had the home advantage. Sarah looked different, tired, less polished than usual. Her perfect composure had cracks in it that I'd never seen before, making her look, for the first time in years, truly human. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, without preamble, her voice soft, almost hesitant. About not asking what you wanted, about treating you like a problem instead of a person. I waited, curious to see where this was going, my heart holding its breath. I talked to a therapist about it, about why I was so fixated on getting you into that place. Sarah's hands were wrapped around her coffee cup like she was trying to warm herself, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from it. She asked me when I started being afraid of you getting older. And it was when Dad got sick. When I realized that loving someone doesn't protect them from aging or dying or needing help. Tears started forming in her eyes, welling up and spilling over. I watched you take care of him, and I thought about how someday someone would have to take care of you, and I panicked. This was more honesty than I'd heard from Sarah in years, a raw outpouring of vulnerability. Why did that scare you so much? I asked gently, my own heart aching for the terrified young woman beneath the hardened exterior. Because I didn't think I could do it, she whispered, her voice breaking completely. I didn't think I was strong enough or patient enough or good enough to take care of you the way you took care of him. So, I convinced myself that the solution was to find someone else to do it. Someone professional, someone better at caregiving than me. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a profound understanding. Sarah, no one expects you to be a professional caregiver. But what if you need help? Real help, not just emotional support. She looked up at me, her eyes seeming much younger than her 32 years, full of fear. What if you get sick like Dad did? Then we'll figure it out together, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. But that doesn't mean signing over my independence now just because something might happen later. I know that now, she said, her voice still shaky. The therapist explained the difference between planning for possible futures and trying to control them. Sarah wiped her eyes with her napkin. She also pointed out that I was treating you like you were already incapacitated, instead of like someone who could participate in planning for her own future. We sat in silence for several minutes, the shared understanding a delicate bridge between us. I thought about Frank's letter, about the daughter he'd been trying to protect me from, but now I could also see the daughter he'd raised. Scared, imperfect, but capable of growth. What about Patricia? I asked, breaking the silence. And Michael? Sarah managed a weak, almost embarrassed smile. Michael was horrified when he really understood what we were planning. He said it reminded him of the way his grandfather's business partners tried to pressure him into selling the company when he got dementia. She even chuckled, a watery sound. Apparently, the Ashford family has some experience with people trying to take advantage of vulnerable seniors. And Patricia. Patricia is Patricia. She's convinced this whole thing got blown out of proportion, that we should have just handled the Dorothy situation more quietly. Sarah looked embarrassed again. She actually said the Dorothy situation. I couldn't help but laugh, a genuine, joyful sound. Well, at least she's consistent. I'm sorry, Mom, Sarah said, her voice earnest now. I'm sorry for calling you a failure. For trying to warehouse you. For treating you like a burden instead of my mother. She reached across the table and took my hand again, squeezing it tightly. I don't know if I can be the daughter you deserve, but I'd like to try. You don't have to be perfect, Sarah, I said, squeezing her hand back. You just have to see me as a person. And maybe ask my opinion before making major decisions about my life, she added, a hint of her old humor returning. Deal. I smiled. But Mom, if you ever do need help, real help, not just the normal stuff that comes with aging. Will you tell me? Will you let me be part of the solution instead of shutting me out? I considered this carefully. The old Dorothy would have promised to handle everything herself, to never be a burden. But Frank's letter had taught me something profound about the cost of protecting people from difficult truths. I'll tell you, I said finally. But Sarah, being part of the solution means respecting my choices, even if they're not the choices you would make. I understand. As we prepared to leave, Sarah hesitated, her gaze distant. Mom, there's something else about Dad's letter. I tensed, wondering if she was going to challenge its authenticity or accuse me of manipulating his words. I'm glad he wrote it. Not because of what it said about me, but because it meant he was still protecting you, even after he was gone. Her voice was soft, filled with a quiet awe. I hope someday I'll be smart enough to love someone that completely. Driving home, I realized that the woman I'd raised was still there, underneath all the fear and calculation. It was going to take time to rebuild our relationship, and it would never be the same as it was before. But maybe, with enough honesty and patience, it could be something better. Something stronger. 6 months later, I was reading in my favorite armchair when my phone rang. It was Sarah, calling with what had become our weekly check-in. Not to manage my life or push me toward any particular decision, but just to talk. "How was your week?" she asked, and I could hear genuine interest in her voice, a warmth that had been missing for so long. "Good," I said, settling back into my chair. "I had lunch with Margaret. Went to the book club at the library. Started reading that novel you recommended." "Back," she said, and then there was a slight pause. "Robert and I went to a concert on Saturday." Robert. He was still a relatively new development in my life. A retired English professor I'd met at the library's lecture series. We'd been seeing each other for about 3 months, taking things slowly, enjoying each other's company. "How are things going with him?" Sarah asked carefully, her tone curious, not possessive. "Very well," I replied, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "He's intelligent, and he treats me like an adult capable of making my own decisions." I smiled, knowing Sarah would catch the subtle reference to our earlier, painful conversations. Amazing how refreshing that can be. "I deserve that," Sarah laughed, a light, genuine sound. "But seriously, I'm glad you're happy. You deserve someone who appreciates you." This was still new territory for us. Sarah showing genuine interest in my happiness rather than just my welfare. The therapy was helping, but more than that, she seemed to be discovering that having a mother with an independent life was actually more interesting than having one who existed solely to be managed. Speaking of appreciation, I said, "How are things with Michael and Patricia?" "Michael's good. He's been asking more questions about my family, about you and Dad. I think meeting you made him realize that not all mothers-in-law are like his mother." Sarah's voice got quieter, more conspiratorial. "Patricia is adjusting. She stopped mentioning assisted living facilities, at least. That's progress." "Indeed," I chuckled. "She asked me last week if you were still harboring resentment about the Meadowbrook situation." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that you weren't harboring anything. You'd simply learn to be more careful about trusting her judgment." I laughed aloud. "I bet that went over well." "About as well as you'd expect," Sarah agreed, a hint of amusement in her voice. But Michael backed me up, which was good. He pointed out that trust has to be earned back after it's been broken. We talked for another 20 minutes, about books, about Sarah's work, about Robert's grandchildren and their upcoming visit. Normal family conversation, the kind we hadn't had in years. When we hung up, I realized how much I'd missed this version of my daughter. The next morning, I was surprised to get a call from Michael. "Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I wanted to ask you something." "Of course, Michael. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about what happened last year with the whole Meadowbrook situation. I realize I didn't handle it very well. I let my mother push an agenda that wasn't in your best interests." I waited, curious where this was going. "I wanted you to know that Sarah and I have talked about it extensively. We've agreed that any future decisions about family matters will include you as an equal participant, not just someone whose life gets planned by other people." "I appreciate that, Michael. There's something else. Sarah mentioned that you might be interested in traveling more now that you're not worried about us pressuring you into assisted living." This was news to me, a pleasant surprise. "She did. She said you'd always wanted to see Ireland, but never had the chance. Patricia and I are planning a family trip to Europe next spring, and we'd like you to join us as our guest." I was quiet for a moment, processing this unexpected invitation. "That's very generous, Michael. But before you say no, let me explain. It wouldn't be a family obligation trip where you'd have to keep up with our schedule or pretend to enjoy activities you don't like. We'd plan some things together, but you'd have plenty of independence to explore on your own." "And Patricia is on board with this?" I asked, genuinely surprised. Michael laughed, a genuine, warm sound. "Patricia suggested it, actually. I think she's finally figured out that having a happy, independent mother-in-law reflects better on the family than having one who feels pushed around and resentful." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, thinking about how dramatically my life had changed in the past year. 12 months ago, Sarah had been planning to put me in an institution and take control of my assets. Now, she was encouraging me to travel internationally and including me in family plans as an equal participant. The difference wasn't just in Sarah's attitude. It was in my own willingness to stand up for myself. Frank's letter had given me permission to fight back, but the real change had come from recognizing my own worth and refusing to accept treatment that diminished it. A year later, I was packing for Ireland when Sarah arrived at my apartment with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery. "Excited about tomorrow?" she asked, settling into the armchair across from my sofa. Nervous and excited, I admitted. It's been a long time since I traveled anywhere more exotic than Hartford. "You're going to love it." "And Mom, I'm really glad you said yes to the trip." I looked up from folding sweaters. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Last year when you were so determined to get me into Meadowbrook, were you really worried about my safety, or were you more worried about the inconvenience of having an aging parent?" She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her coffee cup. "Honestly, both. I was scared something would happen to you, but I was also scared of how that would affect my life with Michael. I wanted the peace of mind that comes with knowing someone else was handling the hard stuff." She finally met my gaze. "And now I realize that the hard stuff is part of loving someone. You can't just outsource the difficult parts of relationships and expect the good parts to remain meaningful." She smiled, a soft, genuine smile. "Besides, you've proven pretty conclusively that you don't need to be handled by anyone." I laughed, a rich, full sound, thinking about everything that had led us to this point. Frank's letter warning me about Sarah's plans, my research into Meadowbrook Manor, the gut-wrenching confrontation in Sarah's living room where I'd finally stood up for myself, and the months of therapy and honest conversations that had followed. "You know what your father would say about all this?" I asked. "What?" "He'd say the best gift he ever gave me wasn't the letter warning me about your plans. It was teaching me that I was worth fighting for." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different. These were tears of understanding and connection. "I think he'd be proud of both of us. You for standing up for yourself, and me for finally learning to see you as a person instead of a problem." "He'd definitely be proud," I agreed. "And probably relieved that he doesn't have to haunt Patricia for recommending questionable senior living facilities." We both laughed at that image. Patricia had indeed adjusted her approach to our family dynamics, though I suspected it was more about maintaining her social position than any genuine change of heart. But that was fine with me. I didn't need Patricia to love me. I just needed her to respect my autonomy. "Mom, there's something I want to say before you leave for Ireland," Sarah said, her voice serious again. I stopped packing and gave her my full attention. "Thank you for not giving up on me. When you played Dad's letter that night, you could have just exposed what I was planning and walked away. You could have written me off as a selfish daughter who didn't deserve a relationship with you." "I thought about it," I said honestly, meeting her gaze. "But you didn't. You gave me the chance to understand what I'd become and choose to be better. Not everyone would have done that." I sat down next to her on the sofa, wrapping my arm around her. "Sarah, you're my daughter. Not because you're perfect, but because we're family. Real family doesn't disappear when people make mistakes. It just requires everyone to work harder at being honest with each other. I love you, Mom. Not for what you can do for me or what you represent in my life, but because you're Dorothy Williams, a woman who worked for 30 years at a job she loved, who raised a difficult daughter with patience and grace, and who had the courage to fight for her own dignity when everyone around her was trying to take it away." As we hugged goodbye, I thought about the long, winding journey that had brought us here. The searing pain of hearing my daughter call me a pathetic failure. The chilling fear of losing my independence to someone else's convenience. The powerful, exhilarating discovery that I was stronger and more valuable than I'd ever allowed myself to believe. Frank's letter had started it all. But the real victory had been learning to see myself the way he'd always seen me, as a person worth respecting, worth fighting for, worth loving exactly as I was. Tomorrow, I board a plane for Ireland. Not as a burden being managed by my family, but as Dorothy Williams, a 69-year-old woman embarking on an adventure she'd dreamed about for decades. Some victories don't come with fanfare or celebration. Sometimes, the greatest triumph is simply the quiet, profound satisfaction of knowing you refused to disappear when everyone around you was trying to make you invisible. And that, I thought as I finished packing, was exactly the kind of legacy Frank would have wanted me to create. So, what do you think? If you were in my shoes, Would you have read that letter? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand up for your own worth against the people you love? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to know.